In the year 587 BC, the city of Jerusalem was attacked by the Babylonian Empire. And a year later, the city and the temple were plundered and burned.
Thousands of Israelites were taken from their homes and relocated all over ancient Babylon. They became exiles.
And so now they're a minority, surrounded by a new culture with new gods.
Now, some Israelites chose to resist Babylon by revolting or withdrawing. Others gave in, adopting the Babylonian way of life and accepting these new gods as their own.
And you might think those are your only two options, but the prophet Jeremiah told them to do something totally different and surprising. To settle in, build houses, plant gardens, grow families, and most surprisingly, to seek the well-being of Babylon and pray to the Lord on its behalf.
So this is like a third way.
Yeah, it's not compromise or revolt.
What does it look like?
Well, there's a whole book of the Bible that explores that question. It's the story of Daniel.
Daniel was one of the Israelites taken into the Babylonian exile.
And because Daniel had a royal heritage and education, he was recruited along with some friends to work in the high court of Babylon.
Work for the enemy? That would be compromise. Or they could gain the king's trust and take him down from the inside.
That's what you might expect, but instead, they take Jeremiah's advice and choose the third way. They serve the king of Babylon, taking on Babylonian names and even clothing style.
So they seek Babylon's well-being. But in doing so, aren't they just giving up their heritage?
It could seem that way, but actually they aren't. As you read on, the story focuses on moments where they draw the line, and they choose faithfulness to their God and resist the influence of Babylon.
So, for example?
Well, like when they're commanded to bow down to the idol of Babylon and give allegiance to the king as if he's a god.
They won't go that far.
Right. This is where you see their true loyalty. It requires them to critique Babylon's idolatry of power, its arrogance, its injustice, but they do it non-violently by laying down their lives. And so God vindicates Daniel and his friends for their faithfulness.
So they would serve Babylon, seek its well-being, but their loyalty was always to God.
Yeah, this is what Jeremiah was envisioning. The way of the exile is a combination of loyalty and also subversion.
So they're still exiles, but don't Daniel and his friends long to go home?
Yes. In fact, Daniel believed that God was going to send a ruler to bring down Babylon and create a true kingdom of peace.
When did he think this ruler would come?
Well, at first he thought within his lifetime, but then he had a dream where he found out that after Babylon would come another oppressive empire, then another, then another.
And so Babylon did fall, and Israel did get to go back home, but now they're ruled by Babylon's successors.
And so they maintained the mindset of an exile, waiting for their true home to come to them. And they continued the same practice of loyalty and subversion to any new versions of Babylon that came along. And this leads us to the time of Jesus.
The empire of his day was Rome, ruled by Caesar. Now, some Israelites wanted to resist, while others gave in and adopted Roman culture and its gods.
But watch Jesus carry on the subversive loyalty of Daniel. Like when he said, it's fine to pay taxes to Caesar, give him back his coins. But then he said, don't mistake Caesar for God. God's the one who deserves your total life and allegiance.
So the way of Jesus is this same mix of loyalty and subversion.
Yeah, like he taught his followers to love and even bless their enemies. But he also got arrested for speaking out against the corrupt leaders of Jerusalem and Rome. He critiqued their idolatry of power, and it cost him his life. But God vindicated him by raising him from the dead as the true king of the nations.
The king that Daniel had hoped for.
Right. And Jesus promised that one day his kingdom would prevail.
And so until then, his followers are living in a type of exile.
Yeah, this is why the Apostle Peter calls followers of Jesus foreigners and exiles. He told them to respect the authorities of whatever place you happen to live, to honor and love all people, but then he reminds them that this isn't their true home. They're still living in Babylon.
But, well, they're not living in Babylon. Babylon doesn't exist anymore.
Or does it? In the Bible, Babylon has become a symbol that describes any human institution that demands allegiance to its idolatrous redefinitions of good and evil.
Okay, so we all live and work in Babylon. How do I seek the well-being of Babylon while my allegiance is to someone greater?
Yes, Jesus' followers are called to live in that tension between loyalty and subversion. That's the way of the exile.
I wanted to show that video as an introduction to what I'm going to be sharing on tonight. I'm going to be discussing culture wars. And as a church, we're going through a series. Now, I'm not sure if Pastor will mention it, but we're going through a series where we're going to be equipping the saints. We're going to be given teachings and different preachings that are going to edify the body to make you and I stronger and better Christians. And so today, what I want to focus on and what I want to teach today is how to serve God in a godless world. We live in a world, we live in a culture, in a society where they want nothing to do with God. And so for this next 2 months, we're going to be focusing on different teachings, different subjects within the Bible. And so today, like I mentioned, we're going to look at the culture wars that we face. Did you know that when we give our lives to God, we find ourselves at war almost immediately? The moment we say, Lord, come into my life, come into my heart, Lord, I say yes to you and yes to all that you have for my life. The moment we give our lives to Jesus, there happens to be a war that we're facing almost every single day. We're facing a war not only with the temptations that the enemy will begin to throw at you. He'll begin to tempt you with your past. He'll begin to tempt you with substances. He'll begin to tempt your life, trying to get you to deny Christ and go back to where you were at. But not only do we face the enemy, but we also find ourselves at war with our flesh. Our flesh desires things. Our flesh desires pleasure. Our flesh desires the easy way and comfort. And so we find ourselves at war with the enemy. We find ourselves at war with our flesh, but we also find ourselves fighting against the culture that we live in. The culture that we live in is a loud culture. When we live in American culture, I'm teaching us a little bit about our culture tonight. We live in a culture where we can be easily influenced and not even recognize it. In American culture, in Western society, there's so many different influences that we look and we see on movies and on TV and on social media that we don't even know we're being influenced by because it's a part of the culture. In American culture, there's so many different influences, but I want to point some out to us here today. There's the culture of consumerism. It is driven by the belief that personal well-being and happiness are closely tied to material possessions and consumption. In other words, the more that we have, the happier that we are. If I were to have more clothes, I would be more happy. If I were to have a newer car, I would be more happy. If I were to have all this and that, and look at what they have, I don't have what they have. If I were to have what they have, then maybe I would experience a little bit more happiness within my life. That's a cultural influence that a lot of us could be influenced by. I need to have this, I need to have that. We become consumers of brands and consumers of fashion and just consuming because we think, and culture teaches us, that if I were to have more, then I would be more happy. Another cultural influence that we see in the Western society is individualism. It is the belief that personal independence, self-reliance, and individual rights are more important than collective or group needs. In other words, it's me, myself, and I. I only think for myself. I'm only concerned about myself and my well-being and my future and maybe my kids and maybe those that are close to me, but people outside my inner circle, I really don't care for them as much. Why? Because there's a cultural influence that's influencing our lives called individualism, where I do things for myself. I isolate myself. I come to church, but the moment I'm invited to a house fire or a connect group or fellowship, then I put up a wall because I do things only by myself. It's a cultural influence of self-dependence. There's no desire for community, and there are weak relationships because people prioritize career and personal success over healthy relationships. This is a cultural influence that we face day to day. There's another one called instant gratification. It is the desire to experience pleasure or fulfillment immediately. without delay or effort. It prioritizes short-term rewards over long-term benefits. In other words, I want what I want, and I want it now. I want what I want, and I don't want no one to stand in the way of what I want. It's the microwave mindset. I'd rather cook a cup of noodles and spend some time in cooking a good quality steak that will probably be better for my life because I want pleasure right now. I want my stomach to be filled right now. And so I go for the cheaper route, the easier route, the drive-through route. It's instant gratification. And in the Western society, I mean, can we be honest? How many of us are easily influenced by the culture of instant gratification? Hey, what do you want to eat? Well, let's go out. I don't really feel like cooking. It's instant gratification. And there are so many different cultural influences, especially in America, like being a workaholic, working and continuing to show up to work, fighting for a promotion, fighting for a new position. All these influences, they will tend to creep into the church through believers that become influenced by the culture. We come to church on a Sunday morning. We come to church on a Sunday night, on a Wednesday night. We show up to prayer, but we still live in this culture. We're still a part of this culture. When we look at John chapter 17, 15 through 19, a very special prayer that Jesus began to pray for you and I. This is a prayer that is recorded that Jesus prayed for his disciples. He was praying for us. He had us in mind in this scripture. He was talking to his Father, and in verse 15 he says, I do not pray that you should take them out of the world, but that you should keep them from the evil one. They are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. Sanctify them by your truth. Your word is truth. As you sent me into the world, I also have sent them into the world. And for their sakes I sanctify myself, that they also may be sanctified by the truth. Jesus prayed a prayer to remind us that though we live in this world, we are not to be of this world. What was Jesus saying? What was he ultimately saying? He was praying a prayer for you and I, and what he was trying to tell the disciples and even us here today, those that are reading the scripture, he says, hey, your job is to not fit into this world. You are not to look like this world. You're not to dress like this world. You're not to talk like this world. You live in this world, but you're not of this world. You're called to be different. But Jesus understood, listen, he said a prayer because he understood there was going to be a cultural war taking place in our lives. As Christians and followers of Christ, this is the battle that we face every day. When we show up to work, there's a culture. When we go to school, there's a culture. When we go to our family house, the parties and the different, gatherings, there becomes a culture. And when there's a culture, you either fit in or you stand out. Either you conform to the culture that is set within that household or that community or that gathering, or you stand on the culture that we are part of, the kingdom culture, God's culture, and you become a follower of Christ by standing out. There becomes a cultural war that takes place within our life. Even Paul tells us to not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that we may prove what is good and acceptable and perfect will of God. We are not to fit into the world's standards of what they say is right and what they say is wrong, but we are here to please the Father and not to please the people of this world. And when I think of someone that can teach us of how to serve God in a godless culture, the person that automatically pops into my head is Daniel. Daniel, like we saw in the video, was a young man that was exiled into Babylon. He grew up in kingdom culture. He grew up in Israelite culture. But for whatever reason, Babylon came in, invaded Israel, and they took Daniel and said, hey, I'm taking you out of your culture, and I'm bringing you into my culture. You're gonna forget about your language and your traditions and your values and what you stand for, and I'm going to teach you a new way of living. Babylon pretty much took all the children of Israel and said, hey, we're going to teach you the Babylonian way now. It's almost like we come into the world and say, hey, we're going to indoctrinate you. We're going to teach you what's right and wrong. We're going to teach you that there's more than two genders. We're going to teach you all these different ideologies, right? But are we going to stand true to God's word and God's culture? In Daniel chapter 1, verse 3, the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge and quick to understand, who had the ability to serve in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and literature of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed for them a daily provision of the king's delicacies and of the wine which he drank, and 3 years of training for them, so that at the end of the time they might serve before the king. Now from among the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Now to them the chief of the eunuchs gave them new names. He gave them a new identity. To Daniel, his name became Belteshazzar. To Hananiah, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. I love verse 8. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. You know, there's something special about someone who God begins to highlight and God begins to elevate to a higher platform. The moment that Babylon came in and invaded Jerusalem, God began to highlight the life of Daniel and his three friends. And it was in a dark season of Israel's history where God was raising up leaders, not with the title, but God was raising up leaders with character. They didn't have a title, or they didn't have a position, or they didn't even have a job or a career. All they had was godly character. And God wasn't looking at the man of the position, but God was looking at the character of the heart. And so he said, hey, I'm going to elevate and I'm going to highlight Daniel and his three friends, because he's going to teach us a little bit of something about how to serve God in a godless culture. Nebuchadnezzar was recruiting the children of Israel to serve in his kingdom. And he was looking for specific men. They had to be young, in whom there was no blemish. They had to be good looking, gifted in wisdom, possessing knowledge and quick to understand, who had the ability to serve. And from this group of people, they were going to teach them their language and their literature. They were going to teach them a new culture, a new way of living. Not only were they going to be taught how to serve in the king's palace, and they were going to be taught how to speak the language and read the literature, but they were also going to be giving Babylonian names. This is very important as they put the screen up here today. We're going to look at the cultural war that is attacking our identity. When we look at the name of Daniel, Daniel's name meant God is my judge. But Nebuchadnezzar said, hey, that's not good enough no more. Something has to happen. You're part of Babylonian culture now. So your new name is Belteshazzar. Lady, protect the king is what that means. Remember a few weeks ago, I was able to preach on a Sunday morning, and I talked about how the enemy is attacking our identity. If you don't know your identity affects your prayer life. It affects the way you see yourself, and it affects the way that you pray to God. So Daniel went from God is my judge to lady, protect the king. What's the shift in the culture? It went from male to female. It went from focus on God to focus on man. And it went from an all-powerful God to a God who needs protecting. Male to female, focus on God to focus on man. And it went from an all-powerful God to a God who needed protecting. When we look at Hananiah, Yahweh has been gracious. Hasn't God been gracious to our lives? Hasn't God been good to our lives? Can we declare that God has been faithful to our lives? That's what Hananiah's name meant. Anytime you said Hananiah, you're trying to get his attention. What you were saying is, hey, God has been gracious. God has been good. God has been faithful. But Nebuchadnezzar said, hey, that's not good enough no more in this new culture. Your new culture is your new name is Shadrach. And what Shadrach means is, I am fearful of God. It went from gracious, loving God to a tyrannical God to be feared. It went from focus on God, God, you're gracious, to focus on self. I'm scared of God. I'm afraid of God. There was a cultural shift that took place within their identity. When we look at Mishael, I love his name because his name speaks of confidence. Who can compare to my God? No one. He poses a question, and in that same sentence, he answers the question, who can compare to my God? There's no one like my God. And then Nebuchadnezzar says, hey, you're a part of a new culture. You're a part of a new city. You're a part of a new identity. Your new name is Meshach. And Meshach means I am despised, contemptible, and humiliated. The shift in the name was focus on God to focus on self, and it went from confidence to being a coward. I'm humiliated. I'm despised. I don't have no self-value. I don't see myself as having any worth. It went from focus on God to focus on self, confidence to someone who became a coward. Azariah, Yahweh has helped. He will say his name anytime God came through. Anytime God stepped into the scene and he made a way and he provided and he fought the battles. Azariah's name, Yahweh has helped. But Nebuchadnezzar said that's not good enough. You're part of a new culture, a new city. Your new name, your new identity is Abednego, the servant of Nebo. In other words, the shift that took place was son of God to slave of man. You're a son of God, a child of God, now the shift is you're a slave to your addiction. You're a slave to a substance. You're a slave to man. There was a cultural war that took place immediately the moment they stepped into a new culture. See, that's what culture will begin to do. It will begin to mess with your identity. It will begin to mess with who you see yourself to be. Though they received new names, and attached to those names were new identities, they still held on to their true identities. See, that's very important for you and I to know, is that when we're a part of God's culture, when we're a part of kingdom culture, though we live in this world, we live in this culture where there's wickedness and sin running rampant, we should know our true identity is not slave to sin, but we're son, we're a daughter of God. We have to hold on to our true identities. In other words, they believe who God say they are more than who the world says that they are. They remain true to their God-given identity. But not only was there a cultural war that took place that attacked their identity, they were also given one more thing. They were given the opportunity to eat from the king's table. The best, tastiest, flavorful food in all the land was found at the king's table. It was almost if the king invited you to his table, that's a big deal. That's an invitation one does not decline. Why? Because you're used to eating wheat and rice and peasant food, right? But the king said, hey, you're going to eat a part of my table now. I'm going to give you the best food, right? But it wasn't a blessing. It was a bad thing disguised as a blessing. The Bible says in Proverbs chapter 23, verse 1, when you sit down to eat with a ruler, consider carefully what is before you, and put a knife to your throat if you're a man given to appetite. Do not desire his delicacies, for they are deceptive food. When you sit down to eat with the ruler, I could imagine, Proverbs was before Daniel. I could imagine Daniel hearing this Proverbs and he was reciting it. When you sit down to eat with the ruler, when a king invites you to the table, be careful and consider carefully what's in front of you. and put a knife to your throat. If you're a man given to appetite, do not desire his delicacies, for they are deceptive food. It's crazy how food plays a huge role in what influences our lives. Food plays a huge role. I wanted to do a how to fast properly message, but I'm going to leave that for another time or for next year. Because food has a huge influence on our lives. Verse 8 says, Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. In other words, Daniel said, hey, I don't want your food. It looks good. Other people might want it. Other people are probably begging to be at the table. But because you invited me, that doesn't mean I have to accept it. Just because it's a part of the culture that you're a part of doesn't mean I have to be a part of the same culture. I'm not going to defile myself with your food. Now, you and I might say, man, what's the big deal? There's probably some good steak in there, some good food, some mashed potatoes, some bomb asparagus, right? Some good food. It's the king's table. It's the best of the best. But Daniel understood. Daniel was willing to learn a new culture. Daniel was willing to learn a new language because he understood he was going to be living here for quite some time. So he might as well get familiar with the culture. But what we see happen almost immediately is that in the beginning of his story is that he took a stand for his convictions. He took a stand for what he believed in. What's the big deal? That it doesn't sound bad to be invited to the king's table. Daniel knew that the king's food was rich and his drinks violated the dietary laws of Israel. And most of the food that was offered up to idols already. So if Daniel were to accept the food that looked good, tasted good, smelled good, he was going to defile the temple of the living God. And he stood true to his convictions in the moment of pressure. I could imagine his friends like, man, dude, you got invited to the king's table. There was cultural pressure, social pressure. You're not going to eat at the king's table? Not everybody's invited to the king's table. But in the moment of pressure, he stood true to his convictions. Daniel knew that he was going to violate the dietary laws of Israel. He was not willing to defile his body with Twinkies and burritos and energy drinks and soda and sugar and candy and I think that's the Message translation. Daniel had convictions. Convictions are strong beliefs or values that shapes a person's decisions or actions. They are firm commitments to what someone believes is right or true. Convictions are those lines that we draw that say, hey, I'm not crossing this line. Convictions are saying, hey, I made a decision already. Whatever you present to me, I'm still not going to cross this line. This is what I believe. This is what's going to honor God. This is what's going to keep me true to who God says that I am. I have convictions. And we have to understand something. I want to teach a little bit here tonight. There are different types of convictions. There are moral convictions that are found in the Bible. There are personal convictions that we come up with by ourselves. And there are spiritual convictions that we have. Why do I mention this? Is that because oftentimes we as people judge people based on our personal convictions. My personal conviction is I pray 5 hours a day. And if you don't pray 5 hours a day, then I'm going to look down on you. But that's my personal conviction. And how oftentimes do we have strong personal convictions and we judge people based off those convictions? Brother, you don't read 7 chapters a day? You don't study the Greek and the Hebrew in the same time that you're reading the Bible? What's wrong with you? And we start judging people based off what? Personal conviction. You know what a personal conviction of mine is? I made a decision a long time ago to no longer drink energy drinks. I had a bad episode. I was never a drug addict. I was never none of that. But I was in a staff meeting. I think Mike, and I'm not sure if Christy remembers this. I was in a staff meeting, and I was drinking a Dutch Bros. Good old Dutch Bros on a hot summer's day. Nothing like a good old Rebel, right? And I was drinking it. And mind you, I wasn't a big energy drinker, but I was drinking energy drinks. And in this moment, of having a staff meeting, pastor sharing his heart, sharing the vision, we're going over dates. My left hand goes numb. It goes numb out of nowhere, and I instantly recognize it. I'm saying, man, I'm like, okay, let me shake it off. Let me get some blood flowing, right? And then I get this pain on my left shoulder. I'm like, oh, it's making its way to my heart, right? It's making its way to my heart. And the enemy has a way of using pain in your body to make you to think that this is your last moment of living, right? In my mind, I'm saying, man, my pastor's going to see me, faint right in front of him. Staff is going to start, what's wrong with Mario? He's having an episode, right? And I had a scare. But in that moment, I made a decision to no longer drink energy drinks or no longer to drink soda. And then later that month, I ended up going to the gym. Why? Because I wanted to prioritize my health. But that was a personal conviction of mine. I can't judge people based off whether they drink energy drinks or not. I can't judge people of their consumption of coffee or sugar. I can't. Why? Because it's a personal conviction. But Daniel didn't have a personal conviction here. He had a moral, biblical conviction. His conviction was based on honoring God and pleasing Him. A conviction that said, God, I'm going to honor you and I want to live my life to please you. Have you ever considered what pleases God? We know what pleases us. New clothes, new technology, a good time at the movies, a nice dinner. What pleases us, we could identify that. But do you know what pleases God? Can you identify what pleases God? Do you know what in your life pleases God? Have you ever asked yourself that question? Man, is my life pleasing to God? Is the way that I'm walking pleasing to God? It might make my parents happy. It might make my friends happy. I'm chasing finances. I'm chasing success. I'm doing everything that they think that I should be doing. But have you ever considered what pleases God? Daniel said, my convictions are based on honoring God and pleasing Him. And when the king presented Daniel with food, Daniel made a decision within his heart to not consume. He had to make a choice either to flow with the Babylonian culture or to stay true to his convictions. You know what the story of Daniel teaches us? Is that culture will test your convictions. The culture at your job will test your convictions. The culture that is in your family will test your convictions. Have a drink. It's just one drink. You're not going to get drunk off one drink. The culture that's within wherever we find ourselves in will test our convictions. Are you really who you say that you are? In front of your boss? In front of someone who has power to promote you, to fire you? Do you change your convictions to get promotions, to get bonuses, to get access? Do you change who you are to get a reward? Daniel stayed true to his convictions regardless of the consequences. See, at that time, if you were to deny an invitation of the king, the consequences were severe. If the king invited you and you declined the invitation of the king, there was consequences to be faced. But Daniel was true to his convictions in spite of the consequences. He didn't know what the consequences were, but he said, hey, if you're going to kick me out, if you're going to kill me, I'm still going to stay true to who I am. Why? Because I live for God. I want to please God. Daniel stayed true to his convictions regardless of the consequences. And when he stayed true to his convictions and he guarded his character, God elevated him to a higher position, and even man honored God. Can I tell you that when Daniel put the army to the test and say, hey, I don't want to defile myself with your food. And then the guy was like, if you don't eat the food and you just eat vegetables, you're going to be weak. If you don't eat of the king's food and you just stick to the fruit and the vegetables, then you're going to look slim and you're going to be weak and your muscle mass is going to be gone. But Daniel stood true to his conviction, say, hey, put me to the test. 10 days later, he was stronger than the soldiers. Why? Because he stayed true to his convictions. You know what happened after that? Is that God honored Daniel. God gave Daniel wisdom. God gave Daniel favor. God elevated Daniel to a higher position at the king's palace. As a matter of fact, it's recorded in the Bible where Nebuchadnezzar said, man, your God is a true God. When you stay true to your convictions, even the people of the world will begin to identify that our God is the true God. Daniel stayed true to his convictions. See, convictions require us to decide what's right ahead of time. You can't make a decision of what your convictions are in the moment of pressure. You got to make a decision right now before you get to your family's house. You got to make a decision right now before you clock into work. What are your convictions? You know, our pastor is big on convictions. Our pastor has taught us to be men and women of convictions. I remember coming into the church and hearing convictions of we don't text the opposite sex past 10 o'clock. Those are convictions. Those are barriers that we have to protect ourselves, our integrity, our purity, our reputation. Right? Why? Because we want to live lives that honor and please God. We have convictions. Our pastor shares it all the time. We don't drive by ourselves with the opposite sex. Why? Because we are people of conviction. We don't bring beers to the party just because our family drinks beer, but we don't. Why? Because we're people of conviction. There will be a cultural war, the kingdom culture versus the world's culture, but we got to stay true to God's culture. See, convictions require us to decide what's right ahead of time. They're not based on what feels good or seems right in the moment. And this is the reoccurring theme that takes place in the story of Daniel. When pressure comes from cultural and different social groups, will you stay true to your convictions? Will you believe what the word says and obey what the word says despite who's in front of you? Despite what type of power your boss may have over you? Will you still obey the word of God when someone says, hey, I want you to do something that's contrary to the word of God? Will you stay true to your convictions? And this was, like I mentioned, the reoccurring theme throughout the entire book of Daniel. Not only did the culture press Daniel to change his convictions, but later on in the book of Daniel, his three friends got pressure to worship the golden statue. In Daniel chapter 3, verse 1, Nebuchadnezzar, the king, made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits and its width 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar built a large statue, a gold image. And he passed a law, a command, a decree that said, the moment you hear the sound of the instruments, whatever you're doing, you ought to stop what you're doing, and you are to bow down, look at the statue, and worship the image. And in the moment's notice, instruments start playing. Everyone hears the sound. They stop what they're doing. They stop cooking. They stop working. They stop fellowshipping, talking. They bow down and worship the idol. See, the word image, translated in the Greek, is where you and I get the word icon. And Nebuchadnezzar wanted them to worship an icon. You might say, man, I don't worship idols, Mario. I don't have statues at my house. But we see the same temptation that Babylon gave to the children of Israel in our culture today. We may not worship an actual statue, but we might worship an icon that we may not even know of. We in Western society are constantly being faced with this temptation, and our convictions are constantly being challenged. Do we worship idols or do we worship God? Do we admire icons in our lives more than we admire the true God? What do I mean by icons? We admire actors, we admire athletes, and we even admire spiritual leaders more than we admire our Father. Those are icons. People that we look up to and we admire, and secretly deep down inside we want to be like them. We want to have the money that they have. We want to have the possession that they have. If my life were just to look a little bit like theirs. But the Bible says that we are to be Christ-like, not icon-like. We are to be like Christ. And we could find ourselves falling into icon worship, idol worship. Not that you bow down and worship it, but you begin to admire it more than we admire our Father. Nebuchadnezzar, like I mentioned, told everyone, the moment you hear the sound, you are to bow down and worship the statue. And if you are to disobey the command that I have given you, you are to be thrown into a fiery furnace. The moment the instruments were played, everyone bowed down because they feared the consequences more than staying true to their convictions. But Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego did not bow to the statue. They did not bow down to the image. They knew what the consequences were. They knew that their life were at stake. They knew that their life might end at this moment. But they stayed true to their convictions. Now, understand this. We have the privilege of knowing the rest of the story. We could read along that story in chapter 3, and we know God showed up. We know the moment that they got thrown into the fire. We know that the moment that they were in there, that the fourth man in the fire showed up. But they didn't know that. They didn't know that. In that moment, when they made a decision to stay true to their convictions, despite the consequences, they didn't know that God was going to show up in the furnace. Will you stay true to your convictions even though you may not know the end result? We have the privilege of knowing the rest of the story. But in that moment, they were preparing to do what was right, regardless of the consequences. What we learn from this story is that when you take a stand for God, He takes a stand for you. When you stay true to your convictions, and when you have convictions that honor God and please God, God begins to do things for your life that He may not do for other people that chose to bow down to the image, that chose to go along with the culture of this world. When you take a stand for God, He takes a stand for you. When you honor God with your character, He will take care of your enemies. As the worship team makes their way, this is a reoccurring theme throughout the book of Daniel. Will you do what is right? Will you live for God? Or will you flow with the culture that's in front of you? How do we live? How do we serve God in a culture that is godless? We have to have strong convictions. We have to have convictions that are biblically based. Convictions that honor God. Convictions that say, God, I don't care what my family says. My family doesn't dictate my convictions. My family doesn't dictate how I live my life. You're my Father. You're the one that has breath. It gives me breath in my lungs. You're the one that I want to honor and please with my life. Our family oftentimes want to create our convictions for us. But as believers and followers of Christ, we look to the Bible to shape our convictions. The last test that we see take place in the book of Daniel, Daniel was tested again. After King Nebuchadnezzar, his grandson, Belteshazzar, took office or took the throne. And then he messed up. He ended up using the cups that were meant for worshiping God, and he poured wine into them, and God began to write letters on the wall. And Daniel was able to interpret the letters, and he said, hey, God's gonna strike you because you used the cups and you poured wine, and your friends had a party. And then a new king came into power. So no longer was King Nebuchadnezzar in charge of the culture. No longer was his grandson in charge of a culture. Now there's a new king, King Darius, that created a new culture. And King Darius didn't know Daniel. King Darius didn't know Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. And King Darius passed a new law. He said, for 30 days, no one is to pray to their God, only to worship me. That's the law that he passed. You are not to pray to no God, whether it's the true God, whether it's a fake God, whether it's an image, a statue that you have right there at your house. You are not to worship and pray to no God. And he passed this law, and he says, if anyone is to disobey this command, a command creates a culture. If anyone is to disobey this command, they are to be thrown into the lion's den. And trust me, these lions are hungry and they're ready to eat. So there was the consequence. The command, the culture, and the consequence. A new king was in place. A new culture was presented. A new command was given. But Daniel remained the same to his convictions. Can I tell you that we live in a world where trends are coming in and out? Fashion trends that go against morality. Language that defiles God and doesn't speak pure things. There are trends that come and go. Culture is constantly changing in the world that we live in. But my Bible says that my God remains the same today, yesterday, and forevermore. Jesus is the same today, yesterday, and forevermore. And even though culture changes, and even though there's a new king on the throne, and even though there's a new president that passes new laws, my convictions are still the same. My character doesn't change. I still serve the living God. I still serve the one and true God. You know what's crazy to me? You know what's crazy to me? Is that when there's transition in power at your job, in our country, in our government, our character shifts with it. All of a sudden we go on social media and we start cussing and I don't like this and what happened, and your culture just shifted with the, or your character just shifted with the culture. If you want to serve God in a godless culture, you have to stay true to your convictions. I'm not going to change even though culture changes. Even though they say that it's okay to drink as long as it doesn't go beyond 0.8, that doesn't mean I'm going to flow with that culture. Culture passes new laws. Culture says new commands. They pass new decrees. They say, hey, it's okay to do whatever you want as long as it makes you happy. That's a new culture. Are we going to conform to that culture? Or are we going to stay true to who God says that we are? I want you to stand with me tonight. Daniel was presented with a new culture, a new command, and he knew the consequences. He knew that if he were to disobey this command, the king was serious about throwing him into the lion's den. But he stayed true to his convictions. He went to his room. As a matter of fact, he opened up his window. He made it known to the world that he was staying true to who he was. And he got on his knees and he began to pray. He began to go after God. God, the king said, I can't talk to you, but I love you so much, I'm going to talk to you. God, the king said that if I were to talk to you and commune with you and have a godly relationship with you, that he was going to throw me into the lion's den. But I love you so much that I don't fear the consequences of man. I want to be with you all the rest of my life. And the people saw Daniel praying. The people saw him praying. And they told the king, they snitched on him. And they told the king, hey, King Darius, Daniel's praying to his God. Daniel disobeyed the command. The command that literally you just passed a few seconds ago, he went and disobeyed the command. They pulled him out of his room. And King Darius said, hey, is it true that you prayed to your God? And Daniel, in the face of the king, said, I disobeyed your command. I talked to my God. I'm giving you a second chance, Daniel. Do you understand what's at stake? Your life is at stake. You're about to lose your life. You have the opportunity to lie to me right now. Did you talk to your God? And Daniel said, yes, I talked to my God. My God is able to deliver me. My God is able to set me free. My God is able to make a way where there is no way. And Daniel stayed true to his convictions. In front of a king that had power to throw Daniel into the lion's den. And he did. He threw Daniel into the lion's den. And he was upset. He was upset with his decision. The very next day, he wakes up and he's eager. And he goes into the entrance of the lion's den. And he shouts, Daniel! Daniel, are you alive? Daniel, was your God able to deliver you from the lions? And from the lion's den, in front of the lions, Daniel was able to say, yes, my God was able to deliver me from the lion's den. When you take a stand for God, God takes a stand for you. When you honor God with your character and your convictions, God makes sure to shut every mouth of every lion that's in your path. Why? Because God is a faithful God. I want you to lift up your hands tonight. You got to make a decision, church. Do you want to serve God in a godless culture? We're going to face temptation. We're going to face pressure. We're going to face so many different things. But God is looking to highlight some men and some women that have strong convictions in their life. I don't care what society says to do. I don't care what laws they pass. I'm going to stay true to my convictions. So tonight, this altar is an altar of saying, God, I want to have convictions. I want to honor you with my life. I want to please you with my life. I don't want to please man. I don't want to do things for man's praise and man's applause. I want to live for you, God. So tonight, I want you to make your way to this altar. This is a moment where convictions are going to be built in your life. I'm going to serve God for the rest of my life. No matter what storm comes my way, no matter what giant stands in my path, my conviction is I'm going to serve God for life. My conviction is, Lord, despite if there's finances in my bank account, I'm going to be a giver. I'm going to give faithfully. Why? Because you're a God that provides. You're a God that's faithful. When you take a stand for God, God takes a stand for you.